The China-India border resolution. What does it mean for Asia? And what could the appointment of a new U.S. ambassador to China signal for the U.S.-China relations? Welcome to China in the News. I'm Christine Ying, and joining me to dive into these important topics is my co-host, China scholar and Thunderbird professor Doug Guthrie. Doug, it's great to have you with us.
So great to be here, Christine. Always enjoy talking to you about China. And as you know, I think this is a really critical time for U.S.-China relations, and there's so much interesting stuff going on in the world right now. And so it's really great to have this conversation, and thank you for being here.
Thanks. Let's dive right in. The China-India border dispute had been going on for a long time. Doug, can you give us a quick overview of the history behind these conflicts?
Sure. And as you know, Christine, I think of myself as I'm a long time and forever China scholar. I'm less knowledgeable about India, but I watch everything that China does in the global political economy for the last 1,000 years, and so this is also a key relationship. So just to set a little bit of framing on this, and I know our watchers and listeners will know this, but I just want to really emphasize the point. So these are the two largest, most populous nations on Earth, right? So both countries at this point have about 1.4 billion population. The global population is about 8 million. And so here we are with 2.8 billion out of 8 billion. So it's about a third of the global population. And so this is, it's a just critical dynamic. Now, just to give a little bit of the history here. Um, so the two most populous nations on Earth, long time history. And this history became very, very difficult going back to about the 1960s. I think 1962 was the Sino-Indian War. And of course, this was right after, shortly after Mao Zedong had come to power in 1949, and then the Great Leap Forward and sort of, a crisis for China. And then, a war, a Sino-Indian War, right? And part of the difficulty of this relationship was that, you know, India became a critical place, just and strategically, because if you have the largest communist nation on earth, and then you have a former British colony, which, by the way, a lot of people don't remember this, but the the Indian Chinese dynamic was very, very difficult for a long time because India was where the the Dutch East India Trading Company was growing opium to sell into China, and eventually there was the Opium War, and the occupation of Hong Kong by Britain. I mean, it was just a very, very, very complex relationship. Okay, and so like post 1962, things were tense, but they sort of cooled. And, China had its own problems. China had tremendous difficulties after the Cultural Revolution and trying to grow itself out of, 800 million people living in abject poverty. And so then we have, the famous moment that I always talk about with Deng Xiaoping coming to Washington, D.C. in 1979 to sign the One China policy with Jimmy Carter. And, you know, so there's, there's the growth of China, but then there's always been this tense relationship between India and China. And, and of course, Pakistan also plays a role in this, and we don't need to get into all of those details, but it's an interesting dynamic. And so it's been tense for many, many years. And there was a very tense border dispute and, you know, skirmishes and deaths in 2020. And then, there's been sort of a détente in that period. So in my opinion, Christine, the October meeting between Xi Jinping and Modi was it was a huge moment. And I think you and I will talk a little bit more about what this means economically, but it was a big moment. So, okay, this has been a tense relationship for many, many, many years. And now we have President Xi Jinping and President Modi shaking hands and figuring out, a détente to the border dispute. And so it's an interesting time.
So China and India just agreed to pull back their troops. So how do they get to this point? How do they decide to make this call after all these years of conflict? I know that in the 4 years ago, there was a skirmish where 20 Indian soldier died and then undisclosed number of Chinese soldier died. So how do they decide to get together now?
Well, I mean, so I love your question because, you know, we always think of these things as just emerging in sort of geopolitical relations and, trying to build. But as you know, I think the BRICS movement and in particular, China and India's relationship in the BRICS movement is probably the most important thing that's going on geopolitically and economically in the world today. And so I think that, as you know, I think President Xi Jinping, he wants to be remembered as the person who brought China to be the largest economy in the world and one of the most powerful geopolitical forces in the world, and negotiating deals between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and you know trying to figure out how all these processes are going. But I think that the key thing is he can't do this without India, right? And so again, BRICS, if you think about Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then, the other countries that have joined BRICS in the last few years, um, this is a big play. Like, this is a big moment. And I think that it's very clear that President Xi and President Modi decided, like, okay, we got to set aside our differences and we just we've got to be partners, because this is a pivot away from the West, Christine. Like, this is a really, really important moment. So, for many years, China has been the United States' largest trading partner, number one and number two largest economy in the world, largest trading partners. And then we had the Trump administration and tariffs, and, so now Mexico is the U.S.'s largest trading partners. But I think there's a very clear sense in China that we're going to pivot away from this. Like, we're going to build BRICS. We're going to build the Belt and Road Initiative, and we can do this without you guys. And so what that means, Christine, is the relationship between India and China becomes really, really important. And so it's
So just so I understand, with both countries finding common grounds now, they can have closer ties, and that would actually increase the influence of BRICS as a whole in terms of trade and multilateral collaboration.
tremendously. I mean, this is just, again, BRICS is not just, so I often say this to my students and anybody who will listen to me, but, I think people don't realize how offensive it is to China that we have the G7 over here, and G7 is, like the most important economies in the world. And, there was an argument when the G7 was formed that, like, well, this is capitalist democracies. And so, like, it's, places like China can't be involved. Well, we know that was a lie, because in 2008, they invited Russia into the G7 because we needed oil. But then Russia was kicked
Became
out.
G8.
Right. It became the G8. And then Russia was kicked out in 2013 because of Crimea. But we know that the sort of apocryphal idea of, like, oh, this is just capitalist democracy is not true, because we let Russia in. And so you can imagine how China, and, I know a lot of people in the Chinese government, and I hear what they say. It's offensive that there's the G7, then the G8, then the G7, but China, you don't get to be a part of it. You're the second largest economy in the world, and you could be at the kids' table, G20.
G20.
Yeah, that's awesome. You're good. You're good. You're at the kids, and that's not Xi Jinping. That is not what he wants. And so I do think that there's this moment, Christine, of, like, Xi Jinping, under his watch, he wants to see China become the most powerful economy in the world and sort of the arbiter of the most powerful geopolitical flows of capital and flows of manufacturing. And so, one of the things that has to happen is you can't be a frenemy with India, because India has a very, very large population and a very large opportunity to build the second most powerful manufacturing supply chain in the world. And so, if China's number one And you and I have talked about that a lot. And I think that's what China has built itself on in the last 40 years. We're going to see a lot of investment of Chinese firms into India. And so, like, the first case study that you and I know very well is Foxconn. And so Foxconn in Chennai, oh goodness, iPhones could be built in Chennai. But as as you and I have discussed, like, the building of manufacturing supply chains is a very complex process, and it involves industrial clusters. But I think what we're going to see is we're going to see more and more Chinese investment in India. That's my prediction.
That is so interesting. What do you think this improved relationship between China and India could mean for U.S. foreign policy in that region, Asia specifically?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, Christine, and I just think what it means. So two levels of the conversation. One is we're going to see a lot more economic investment, and a lot of Chinese companies like to think about going global. And when we think about Chinese companies going global, we think about, like, okay, investment in Germany, investment in the United States, investment in Phoenix, as is the case with TSMC. But what I think we're going to see is much more investment in India. I think, like, what we're going to see is a pivot, the BRICS pivot away from what everybody thinks that the relationships of the world are the largest economies of the world. But I think what we're going to see is a increasing reliance on the building of industrial supply chains in India. And we're going to see Chinese firms leading the way. So we're going to see, first is Foxconn. I don't have any inside information on this, but I will make a prediction. Next, we're going to see Lens, and then we're going to see Luxshare ICT, and then we're going to see lots of these companies that serve the high tech sectors. And I think we're going to see, like, a really, really interesting alliance. And so you know the October shaking of hands between President Xi and President Modi, I just think it was a much bigger moment than a lot of people think, because this is a moment where we're like, okay, now this is going to be an engagement of the BRICS. And this is not just BRICS in general. This is BRICS, two largest, most populous nations in the world. And so,
For the benefit of our viewers, we're going to have a special episode coming up on BRICS and the Global South. Anyway, thank you. Let's switch topic to the appointment of the new U.S. ambassador to China. David Perdue, known as a China hawk, has been nominated. Doug, why is this appointment such an important? Why is it such a big deal at this moment?
well, Christine, I mean, it's a great question. And I speak about this as a China scholar and maybe a China dove. But, you know, President Trump he's appointing a lot of China hawks, right? So there's David Perdue, there's Marco Rubio. Like, it, I was just in a session, Christine. Oh, you were there, so you know about this session. But, like, we were both in this session with a bunch of Chinese entrepreneurs, and it's an amazing question that Marco Rubio, he's not allowed in China right now.
Yeah, he was one of the 11 congressional representatives sanctioned by China.
So think about that, right? Like, somebody at this level who's a China hawk, and what's it going to mean that he can't go to China? And so David Perdue, you know, I'm on the one hand, I'm scared because I want our two countries to just continue working together. And as you know, I'm an engagement policy guy. Like, I just believe that economic engagement and continued development, like getting China into the WTO, et cetera, I think this is really important. But I try to tamp down my scaredness and instead think, like, okay, but the interesting thing is these people are business people. And so one of the most interesting things, Christine, in this moment is the role of Elon Musk, because these people are business people, and the companies that are most at risk, and this is just me saying this as a prediction, but you know, I've had some experience with some of these companies. The companies that are most at risk for a tense US-China relationship are Apple, Walmart, and Tesla. And Elon Musk, I'm sure he's whispering in President-elect Trump's ear and saying, like, dude, we got to make this work. We've got to make this work. And so my guess is that, when I woke up after the election and it was like, oh my God, 60% tariffs and blah, blah, blah. My guess is that it's going to be okay, because these are business people and they understand that if it was the case that we got into an economic Cold War with China and suddenly Tesla, Apple, and Walmart experienced very difficult times in China and were maybe kicked out of China, it's not good for the US capital markets. And that's what I just think. These people are smart. Like, they know they know what's going to happen. And so I think there's going to be negotiations. I think there's a lot of bluster, but I think
Sounds like we'll have to do a special episode on Elon Musk, Tesla, and China.
I would love that. That'd be fun.
Yeah.
That'd be fun.
Well, so what challenges do you think David Perdue will face and will need to navigate as the new ambassador? Do you think his nomination will pass?
Well, so it's a great question. And again, I'm not a politico, but my guess is that his nomination will pass. Like, I don't know, but like, the negotiations of what happens in Washington, my guess is they're gonna figure this out. And when they don't figure these things out, people like Matt Gaetz step down. Like, it's just like they know this, right? But Purdue is, you know, he's a serious dude. Like, he was a senator. I mean, it's gonna be okay. He's a China hawk. But the interesting thing, Christina, I think, is, what does this mean for US-China relations? And again, like, the big, 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 big outline question here is Taiwan and the Taiwan Relations Act and what's going to happen. And so this is where people like Marco Rubio and David Perdue become a little bit, they make me nervous, because we have to get to a detente. Like, we cannot have like a war with China, and we cannot have like an economic Cold War with China. And so where I think it's really interesting with David Perdue and like all of the hawkish people that President-elect Trump is appointing or nominating, I want everybody to be like, let's get to the table and let's really have constructive conversations, because, I mean, you and I think I'm older than you, but like, we grew up in the Cold War era, right? Like, you remember when the Soviet Union and the United States were pointing nuclear missiles at each other. Like, we don't need that. Like, what we need is economic integration. And that's what was so interesting about this period of the last 40 years that you and I have been studying after Deng Xiaoping came here, is like, okay, economic integration. Like, how are we changing each other, and how are we coming closer together? And how is our companies like Apple and Tesla and Walmart so deeply embedded in China? And so I just think we got to continue that. Like, and that's my pitch. And like, if President-elect Trump called me, I would tell him that. And so, like, I can't predict what David Perdue will do. He's a hawkish guy. So is Marco Rubio. But I just think we have to have economic engagement. We have
Uh,
to.
let's tie this all together. Do you think there's any connection between Purdue's appointment and the evolving China India relationship? How does this fit into US broader strategy in Asia?
I love that question. And let me just say, it just seems like it's the Trump the president-elect Trump administration's like, let's just do a lot of hawkish people and like, let's get tough. But again, when I was, thinking about this right after the election, I was like, oh my God. But then I calmed myself down. And I think the economics and economic entanglement is too much. Like, there is no way that we can walk away from each other. And so my guess is like you'll have like the hawkish people on the right side, which are David Perdue and Marco Rubio. And then you'll have Elon Musk. And Elon Musk is going to be going to the Chinese government and saying, like, we got you, dude. Like, let's figure this out. Just like, Tim Cook was. Right. And so, like, I just think I've calmed down a little bit. I'm less stressed because I think these these guys do not want it on their watch that the U.S. capital markets tanked because, Apple, Walmart, and Tesla got kicked out of China. Like, it can't be. And so I'm more optimistic, but it's complicated, and we just need to, try to figure out, like, okay, how can we support these guys? And so even though I wouldn't be, somebody who was y- on David Perdue's bum list, like I think we all need to just be supportive of thinking about geopolitical economic relations and engagement.
Doug, thank you so much for sharing your insight. It's been such an interesting conversation. And thank you for all who tuned in. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. See you next time on China in the News. Take care.